So at the end of the week, that project proposal is due. So this is just, a paragraph, a couple sentences where you're giving me the question or the topic, the idea that you're kind of thinking about. If it's not the most exact thing, that's okay. We can kind of send you a response to whatever it is to kind of maybe phrase it this way and think about it this way. But it gives me an idea about what topic you're interested in, what data might be available, and helps me help you start to collect some of that. So I've had a couple of you reach out already, and I actually should be working on those after class today. Any ones that have gotten me up to this point, and then as well tomorrow. So if you've given me a request, if you don't get data by the end of the day tomorrow, send me an email. Just double check. Maybe I might have something slipped through the cracks, but that's kind of where we're at with that. The homework is due today by the end of the day, so you can upload that to Canvas, or if you want to turn in a hard copy at the end of class today, that's okay as well. Other than that, we obviously missed Thursday's class. I kind of did a live Zoom. Some of you kind of were in there. If not, I'm expecting you kind of watch that as like a typical class. If you didn't show up, that you kind of go on and watch that recorded lecture. Okay. I'll also be putting up an online quiz after class today. That'll be due before we start class on Thursday. So they'll have a couple questions over whatever we did today, and probably a question or two over the reading, which I will get posted after class as well. I'm kind of going back and forth between two papers. It probably depends on kind of where we stop today, which one I'll use, but that should show up under the files and then course readings tab. So that week 5 reading should show up there after class. Okay. All right. Other than that, any questions for me before we kind of jump into things today? Okay. So one thing kind of left off with starting to think about, with these teams or these leagues have a lot of monopoly power quite often, and thinking about different pricing strategies that might optimize optimize profits, given that they have that power. So some different pricing strategies we'll see them use. One of them is bundling, right? So teams typically kind of do this where they package certain games together and then sell them as like one product, right? So you might get a bundle of 3 tickets, or 2 tickets, but to specific games, right? So usually this is going to be a more profitable kind of strategy if you kind of pair non-high demand with low demand high demand with low demand games, right? Or less attractive games kind of bundled with more attractive games, right? So the consumer usually gets a better price for whatever game that they would have paid more for. And then they overpay a little bit for the game that they didn't really care about going to as much, but overall they could potentially benefit from this bundle. So we'll kind of see how this works in just a second. I think I had some examples. So like, maybe the Cubs or the White, look at kind of their games of the White Sox, know there's high demand in Chicago. And so in order to kind of maximize their entire profits from the revenue kind of over the season, maybe they package it with games that they think might be less attractive, right? Or not generate as high of a demand as the other games, right? So they might say, if you want to buy the Cubs White Sox tickets, you're going to have to buy a Cubs White Sox ticket as well as a Cubs Reds ticket. Okay. And you'll see this in college games too. They kind of bundle games that are conference games with some non-conference, like lower quality opponent games. Whoops. So what's this going to look like? So you kind of imagine, let's think about, we'll use, I don't know, that Cubs White Sox one would be good. So let's say, if I'm looking at overall demand, right? And I try to set a single price and I set it at $75. Okay, so this is across all games. We're just going to act naive at first, which is we just set a single price for every game across the season. Right? Well, if I look at the actual demand curves and I figure out, how much would somebody be willing to pay for that Cubs White Sox ticket? So we'll call this kind of, we'll call it CW for kind of that Cubs White Sox ticket. Maybe the actual marginal benefit of the consumer to buy that one ticket, maybe it's something like $150. They pay up to that amount. And maybe the marginal benefit to the consumer for that Cubs Reds ticket, maybe that's only, let me see, make sure I get my numbers here. It would be $50. So we know that people will be willing to pay up to their marginal benefit. So if we were able to observe this, and charge individual, each game, that would be great. We could charge $150 for the Cubs White Sox ticket and $50 for the Cubs Reds. But there's no like one kind of like we think about a representative consumer, but every consumer is different. So not everyone's going to have these valuations, right? So instead of trying to kind of set a price individually for both games and say, I know this is more a highly valued game, I know that the total amount that this consumer would be willing to pay for these two tickets would be what? $200. Right? And so, maybe like I said, this is the representative consumer. On average, the consumer that would pay about $200 for the combination of both of these tickets. So if I just set the price at 75, how many tickets would I sell? Like every game is $75. How many tickets would this one consumer purchase? One, right? Which game would they choose to buy a ticket to? Well, if they valued this game at 150, they would have paid up to that amount. Then for sure they'll, gladly pay 75. However, for the other game, the valuation, the benefit to the consumer is less than the price, so they wouldn't buy it. Right? But if I bundle these two games together and charge 200, now how many tickets have I sold? Right? So I think about the quantity for a single price. I'm only going to sell one of these tickets. But if I bundle them and have this bundle price of $200 as opposed to just charging kind of my single price of 75 for each one, I'm going to sell both tickets. What's total revenue? Well, just price times quantity, right? So here I would be having total revenue 75. Well, here my total revenue would be what? No, sorry. I'm selling the bundle for $200. So total revenue would just be 200 there. Right? It doesn't matter what the quantity is there because I've sold the price as a bundle or sold it with a bundle price. So I've increased total revenue, right? And I've extracted kind of more surplus from these consumers. Right? So the bundling price is kind of good for the team. In a sense, it's good for the consumer as well. They're attending more games. Now, that being said, their surplus is kind of being driven down, right? They're paying exactly how much they benefit, right? So if we think about consumer surplus being the difference between the marginal benefits to consumer and the marginal cost, which is price, well, here, those two things would be exactly equal, right? And, before they would have had what? $75 of surplus, okay? 150 minus the price of 100 or 75. So this is one way that teams or leagues could extract some consumer surplus and kind of turn it into revenues or profits for them, right? Yeah.
With like per ticket, the bundle would be $100.
Yeah. So you could do like a price per ticket is 100, and then you would have your kind of traditional total revenue, right? Where you could say 2 times 100.
Yeah, but since that's higher than 75, would they not go for the bundle since that's higher than what they would pay?
So if they're both offered simultaneously, like they can just purchase one ticket at 75, or they could purchase the bundle. Is that kind of what you're asking? So it wouldn't make sense for the team to allow both options. So if you're going to bundle these tickets, you should only sell the bundles, right? Because otherwise, like you said, everyone's just going to not buy the bundle and choose to just buy the ticket to the one game that they really highly value, right? At that lower cost of 75, right? If I offer both of these, well, now the game I really wanted to go to, the price actually went from like 75 to kind of like 100 for that game, right? So I just paid more for the game I cared about, just eating into my own surplus. So if both of them were offered, you're right, we'd see a lot more people just purchase single tickets to that Cubs White Sox game, as opposed to purchasing the bundle. But maybe allowing the bundle, right? There's going to be all kinds of different consumers, right? So maybe I think that some of my consumers are more like, let's say maybe they just enjoy games altogether. What do I want to see the scenario of? Let's say there's some people that really just don't care about the Cubs White Sox. They're just Reds fans, right? So maybe it would look more something like this, right? In which case, maybe they wouldn't purchase the bundle price, right? Or maybe they would if they really valued that Reds game, right? Because then they could get away with paying, So there's all these different combinations of what the consumers could like. I'm just saying that there are some consumers who might choose to purchase the bundle, but there could be some that don't if both of those were offered. In this scenario, if I think that most people have a valuation that looks something like this, then it would make sense to only offer that bundle, right? Because I know otherwise they would just, which is more likely, would be the optimal strategy there. Yeah.
Why is the total revenue just 200?
So, because you can think about it, the price for both of the games combined, the bundle price, right? Packaging these two things together, they were only paid $200, right? So if I want to think about it as a price per ticket, well, then I could use the more traditional price per ticket times the number of tickets I sold and get that same $200. Yep. Yeah, so this isn't a benefit to consumers, right? This is the team deciding we're going to bundle these products together because we know that we can actually extract more surplus from consumers. Yeah, when we think about, you might think about bundling, you're thinking about more of like quantity discounts, which we'll get to in just a second. It's a similar idea. It's just that it could potentially benefit the consumer, but it's a little bit different than what we would call bundling. Any other questions there before we keep moving? Okay. So then kind of, we start to talk about being able to charge different prices, right? Maybe a bundle price, but maybe we start to want to be able to try to really charge consumers different prices. We'll talk about something called price discrimination. So perfect price discrimination, I'll kind of give you a graphical representation, but it's basically, if we look at the demand curve and think about at each point of the demand curve, it's really representing different consumers. If we could correctly identify who the consumers were and exactly what their marginal benefit to purchasing these tickets was, or even apparel, whatever market we're looking at, we could charge them exactly what they value it at, right? Because they would pay up to and equal to that amount. Okay? So if we were able to perfectly price discriminate, we can actually extract all of consumer surplus, turning it into producer surplus. Okay? So I'll show you what this looks like graphically. Right? So I'll just use a general ticket market here. So even if we were in a situation where we are below below the capacity, right? We didn't have demand high enough to really sell out the entire stadium. Even if that was the scenario, what would perfect price discrimination look like? Well, if I'm just a general monopolist, right, then I make my decision based off of this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. This would be my kind of optimal quantity. So a single price monopolist would choose this single price. That's what I call this SP for single price monopolist. And we would have had kind of this area here, which would have represented what? Yeah, dead weight loss, because the kind of quantity for a perfectly competitive market, right, is to set that price at zero and just sell the stadium. Now, if I have monopoly power, it's not what I'm going to do. Right? As a single price compared to a single price monopolist, a perfectly price discriminating monopolist can say, well, look, I can correctly identify the consumer who values that very first ticket. I can see who values it the most. I'm able to identify them somehow. Right? For a second, just don't worry about how they're doing that. We'll talk about that in a second, but somehow they're able to do that. Well, then I could charge the person exactly whatever their marginal benefit would be, right? I could set the price very high for them. And then the next person, I say, well, they don't value it quite as much, so I'll charge them a slightly lower price, and then so on and so forth. Well, think about what I'm doing there is basically my demand curve becomes my marginal revenue curve. Because every additional unit I sell, the amount of additional revenue I can make is whatever the marginal benefit of the consumer is, because I can charge them exactly that price. So we end up with a scenario where consumers are paying exactly how much they value it at. So marginal benefit of the consumers is always equal to the price. So my consumer surplus there, right? We think about, I think I wrote this out, it's going to be the difference across every consumer, right? The difference between their marginal benefit and the price they pay. Well, here, every consumer is paying exactly their marginal benefit, so consumer surplus goes to zero. And what have producers done? Well, for producer surplus, we said that's kind of like add up. So that summation sign just means add up for every consumer. So add up the difference between the price that they can charge, right? And the difference between how much it costs them to provide it. Well, here, my marginal costs are zero. The price I'm able to charge is wherever I'm at in the demand curve. So producer surplus becomes this entire area. So deadweight loss goes back to zero under a perfectly price discriminating monopolist. And the quantity, we'll call this the discriminating monopolist charges will sell all the way out to the point where that was perfectly competitive. And the price they charge obviously will kind of vary across those consumers, right? The price of the discriminating monopolist is really just the demand curve or each consumer's marginal benefit. So you can imagine if I'm able to correctly identify how much people are willing to pay and charge them exactly that amount, well, then I can really hurt consumers, right? I can take all of consumer surplus and turn that into producer surplus. Okay. Any questions on this? So, this sounds like, well, how would they be able to do this? So what do you think? This is just definitely a little bit more theoretical in the past, and they're able to really correctly identify who values these things. But one way I could do this is maybe through auctions, right? I know that, whoever's going to pay the highest amount is going to be whoever values it the most, right? They'll continue to bid up and up and up as long as that price is below their marginal benefit. So I can get a lot closer to perfect price discrimination. I usually can't get perfect price discrimination. I can get kind of a, move towards it, right? You think about what's something that's in the last 20 years made doing some price discrimination stuff a lot more possible. Maybe go back in general, maybe go back 30 years. Yeah, right. So they price discriminate, right? Because you're all paying different prices depending on how much aid you get, right? I know that I saw a thing a couple weeks ago, I think. Depending on your search history, Amazon actually might show you different prices for the same good. Like you could look up something, you'd have different prices. Why? Because based off of what you've bought in the past, they know that you are much more likely to value this item higher and that you'd be willing to pay a little more, right? So because there's so much data surrounding like purchase history, just even search history, right? They are able to correctly, use that data to identify consumers that might be willing to pay a little bit more, right? This is basically what, marketing and marketing is right now. Like a lot of these companies will send targeted coupons, right? Because they know that you might not be willing to pay quite as much. So they're going to change the price to be a little bit lower for you, right? So, this is, something that, because there's so much data out there on purchase history and kind of consumer behavior and habits, firms or companies, teams here in this situation are able to move kind of more towards that perfect price discrimination scenario, right? Probably not perfect prices, but some, right? So that's the idea of kind of price discrimination. We could also see them use something we call two-part pricing. So this is actually, very specific to, there are other applications, but this is very specific to kind of sports. So we think about two-part pricing. We're first going to charge a fixed cost, right? A large fixed cost just to purchase this good, right? But then from there, we're actually going to set the price of the good equal to whatever whatever my marginal cost is to providing it. Well, this is kind of interesting because we think about what's something that you pay a large upfront fee for, and then really it's up to you to choose however many you want to go to, and the price essentially is zero. Right? Well, if I've got season tickets, once I pay this huge upfront fee, I can choose to go to whatever games I want. I can go to all of them. I could go to only 2 or 3 of them, right? But the cost of each game is essentially zero after I have this huge fixed cost. So what should that fixed cost amount be? Right? That's what the teams are trying to figure out. What's this price that we could charge for season tickets, right? As opposed to just selling these tickets one, individually. Right? So what we're going to do with two-part pricing, and this is essentially the price of the ticket is zero, right? Once they purchase the season tickets. Now there's other costs, right? The opportunity costs, things like that, but in terms of the price they're paying for the ticket. So what teams try to do is think about an individual consumer, right? Here, stadium capacity doesn't really come into play, right? Now we could change capacity to be like the number of season ticket holder seats, but really the idea is we're thinking about for each individual consumer, how many games would they go to, right? Or how many tickets across the season would they purchase for themselves, right? So there might be some demand curve here. And this represents an individual consumer. Now, no one consumer is ever going to meet capacity, right? They can only attend the game one time. I guess theoretically you could buy 4 season tickets to have room around you, but that would be kind of very specific to if you benefited greatly from not having people around you, then you're just paying the additional money because you value not having people around you, not for the actual seat you purchased. So we've got this representative consumer, and we could think about, their marginal benefit for every single quantity. We could kind of determine here. I'm going to use this graph for some other examples too, so it doesn't make the connection here in a second. So at each one of these quantities, we can figure out how much people will be willing to pay. So for the first ticket, right, maybe the first game that this consumer values the highest, maybe it's $100. For the next game, they value the second highest, or the second ticket they would purchase across the season, they pay 80, so on and so forth. Right? I think my math isn't going to work out here because what, 4, 5, 6. So I did 6 game seasons instead of 8. I was kind of thinking about maybe using football, but what do I want? I actually want this to fall. It's all right. For the context of this example, okay. So we've got that. I know that if they were purchasing each ticket one at a time, they'd be willing to pay less and less as they purchase more of these. Right? So how can I sell these tickets as a bundle or as a block of tickets, right? So it's kind of like bundling, but a little bit different, right? Because I'm not bundling, just 2 of the games across the season. I'm bundling every game, right, for this one consumer. So I know that the difference between kind of their marginal benefit, right, and the price they pay, that's going to be consumer surplus. But I know they'd be willing to pay up to this amount. So I know that if I think about, so where would this stop? So if I go to 4, it'd be 40, 5 would be 20. So at that 6th game, their demand curve kind of hits the x-axis, right, or hits 0. So I know that consumer surplus, if the price to them was 0, okay? So let's assume the ticket cost to them is 0. Consumer surplus would actually be the area under how much they benefit, or that demand curve, but above the price of 0. So I know that consumers, if I sell these tickets as like a season ticket of 6, or a season block of tickets of 6 games, I messed up the math here, so that doesn't have an application to a specific sport. But think about, there's a sport where they only played 6 games, maybe like college football, if they sold kind of a season ticket there, so home games. Consumers would pay whatever their surplus amount was here. So how can we determine what that fixed fee should be? Well, basically, I'd have my intercept up here at 120. This point is 0, 0. I'm just finding the area of a triangle here. All right, the height goes from 120 to 0. The base goes from 6 to 0. It's a triangle, so times 1/2. So here, what? The amount that I would charge for these season tickets for this consumer would be $360. Right? And that way, I've actually extracted all of consumer surplus and turned it into producer surplus. Because I know that consumers would be willing to pay up to that amount for those season tickets. Now, this gets hard to do because you have to correctly identify what your average consumer is, or your representative consumer, right? But with season tickets, it might actually be a little bit easier to do, because season ticket holders, like once I see who's purchasing the tickets year after year, I have probably an idea about what the characteristics are, what the income levels look like, and we're probably able to get a lot better idea about what demand actually is over time. Right? But this would be the idea of kind of 2-part pricing. It's just that this is a weird situation where here's my huge fixed fee, right, or my kind of first price, but then kind of my second price, it's so 2-part pricing, right, is that once you purchase these season tickets, the cost of attending the game is just 0, right? You don't have to pay any additional amount of money for every additional game you go to. So what's another example of maybe like a fixed fee? It just kind of operates a little bit differently, just like to make a connection outside of sports. Is something like Costco or like Sam's, where you purchase like pay a fixed fee to be a member. And then supposedly the price, right, the second price there is just that the goods are a little bit cheaper, right? Whether or not that's the actual case, I don't know. You have to price it all out and actually figure out if that's the case. But that's the idea behind what they're doing, right? You pay this huge fixed fee to become a member, and you pay these lower prices. You pay a huge fixed fee to be a season ticket holder, and then you pay this lower price to attend the game. Any questions on that before we keep moving? All right, so the next thing is going to be kind of similar, right? But it's that I can offer quantity discounts, right? So I know that people's marginal benefit is falling, right? The more tickets they purchase, right? If you think about my example of a representative consumer over the entire season, the game that they're going to pay the most for is, whatever game they find the most interesting. Then this game they find the second most interesting, they'd pay a little bit less for, right? Their marginal benefit is going to be a little bit lower. And so we know that this consumer has decreasing marginal benefit, right? Marginal benefits. So I know they won't be willing to pay as much for the second and third ticket as that first one they purchase on the season. So what I can do, it's going to look very similar to what I was drawing this out for thinking about this two-part pricing. Here, I'll draw it in a different color so we can identify this as kind of not two-part pricing anymore, but we're thinking about maybe quantity discounts. So if I'm able to set different prices depending on how much people buy, right? If this is my representative consumer, how much am I going to set the price when they're buying that first ticket? If I'm able to observe this demand curve, how much would I set the price for the first ticket a person bought for my games? Yeah, right. Well, they value it at 100, so I'm going to try to set it exactly to what their marginal benefit is. And maybe I then say, okay, you've already bought one ticket. If you buy a second, what price would I kind of charge for that? Yeah, I know they value the second one wherever I'm at in my demand curve because it reflects marginal benefits. So I'd set, once you buy, the second ticket, I'll cut the price by $20. And then for the third ticket they purchase, I would set it to 60. Right? Now, if I do it this way, kind of compared to my two-part pricing, what am I losing out on? Well, I mean, really nothing if I'm able to exactly identify how much they'd be willing to pay. Right? But, this is like a representative consumer. It's probably more likely when I do these quantity discounts, I'm like, everyone's demand curve has a little bit different of a slope. So I'm probably going to maybe err on the side of caution, and maybe I only decrease the price by 10, right? So I know that some people, right, are going to choose to continue to purchase, some won't, but I'm trying to set something where I think that I can extract a little more surplus from consumers. Okay, because if I just set the price at something like, let's say I set the price at $75 here, just a single price. Well, I know they would purchase two tickets at $75, so I'd make $150. But if I'm able to do this quantity discounts, maybe now I can sell 3 tickets, and here I'm already at $240, right? So if I'm able to really set a different price depending on how many, right, the quantity that someone's purchased, I'm likely to be able to extract a lot more surplus than just setting a single price. Questions on that one? I kind of double dipped and used the graph to do both, but I think it kind of has the nice visual for both of these. Okay. All right. So, we might see teams do this where, if you buy multiple games, the price of additional games there kind of goes down. We might also just see some general segmented markets. So this is price discrimination, but specifically usually called third-degree price discrimination. So this is where I've got some characteristic that I know I can use to identify differences in the demand curve, right? So this is things like offering groups that might not have as high of a demand curve, right? Or I know that might not be willing to pay as high of a price, I can offer them different prices. So student or alumni discounts, right? Selling tickets like that. Think about if there's senior discounts. I know that, senior citizens are on fixed income, less likely or have less ability and willingness to pay. And so maybe I'm setting different prices for them, right? Or maybe I know that the real fanatics, right? If I'm able to identify, maybe at college football, maybe I think my alumni, I might want to try to target with higher priced seats, right? So maybe I kind of can think about if you can prove alumni status, maybe I think that views that you're willing to pay more money, right? I'm just using a characteristic to really identify something about the differences in demand curves between those groups, right? Anything I want to say here? So that's not, that's nothing crazy. Really there, you would just think about, I've got a representative consumer who's not a student and a representative consumer who is. I have differences in demand, and those differences in demand would tell me kind of their willingness to pay, right? Identify different equilibrium prices for those two different groups. And that would just be third-degree pricing. Right? Now, we usually need some type of identification because let's say I sell these tickets to students at a lower cost. If I'm a student who doesn't really value going to the game very much, and there's a lot of people who aren't students who value it much higher than me, what might that student take that ticket he or she bought at a lower price and do? Sell it to someone who values it more, right? That way they can make more, they can get a lot of additional benefit from selling it. There wasn't a huge, benefit lost because they didn't really value going to the game very much. And so we have to make sure if we do this kind of segment, third degree pricing, I don't want to lose out to kind of this secondary market like StubHub or some things like that, right? And so maybe what I do is I make sure that if I'm selling it to these groups at different prices, I have some type of check. So for instance, like with the student discounts at a lot of collegiate games, they'll make sure if you have a student ticket, you have to have a student ID to get in the game. That way I can't just sell my tickets off to someone who's not a non-student. Any questions on this? This one really isn't too bad, kind of a combination of things we've talked about. It's really just identifying two different consumer bases. All right, so one other thing we can start to think about, and we kind of touched on this already, with the idea that in some cities, maybe demand is high enough that you could have two teams, but in most cities, there's not, right? So this is kind of the idea of a natural monopoly. So we can think about these natural monopolies and why they exist. So it would have to be, if there is a natural monopoly, that as soon as that second firm enters the market or the second team enters that city, you think about it that way, that the costs are so high that splitting kind of demand and revenues within that city between two teams doesn't allow either one to make a positive profit. In the long run, we know that firms will exit with negative profits, so one of them leaves. But then once there's only one team, there are now positive profits, right? So it's just that there's such high cost that switch from going from 1 to 2 leads from positive profits to negative profits for two firms. So let's think about what this would look like in terms of a natural monopoly, and we'll kind of come back to those bullet points. I can use this one. So let's say it's something that looked like this, right? And I'm thinking about, maybe think about the wins market, right? So there's some demand and marginal revenue curve, right? There's a certain amount of revenue associated with each win, right? Each win would bring additional revenue, okay? So let's say we'll assume kind of constant marginal costs here, okay? And make this easy, right? So if constant marginal costs, right, then you can actually think about, I'll have this average total cost curve. Now, if my marginal costs were the only thing, then my average total cost curve actually ends up being the same as my marginal cost, right? Because total costs would be quantity I sell, which here that's quantity I'm selling, that's kind of the number of wins I'm targeting, right? Times the marginal cost, that'd be my total cost. Well, the marginal cost is always the same number. When I look at the average total cost, divide by my quantity or wins here, my average total cost curve would just become my marginal cost. However, if I think about, there's likely some huge fixed costs here, right? Then my average total cost, right, I'll divide by the number of wins here, becomes my marginal cost, but plus this additional component. And this additional component is becoming smaller and smaller as I target a higher and higher number of wins, right? Because as the denominator gets larger, that would get smaller. So it's going to look something like kind of this downward sloping curve. So let's first assume that we've got something that looks like this, right? So this is like my average total cost curve, right? It's just kind of decreasing, right? And as I win a higher and higher number of games, this gets closer to zero. My average total cost gets closer and closer to my marginal cost curve. So if a team here was choosing to kind of the optimal number of wins to profit maximize, you can kind of think about, we don't really talk too much about this y-axis when we're looking at the wins market, but this kind of represents the total amount of money that would be brought in, or if I was able to kind of charge a price per win, that I took like all my markets put them together, this would kind of represent how much money I'm making by this number of wins. So on average, right? So like my average total revenue essentially, right? So this would represent my average total revenue. This would represent my average total costs. If average total revenues are greater than my average total costs, oops, if I can write the acronym correctly, well, then profits are going to be positive here, right? So a natural monopoly would be something like this. So first of all, are there any questions? I know I went through that kind of quick, but we're thinking about, unless there's like some additional revenue sharing, we said our demand curve also kind of representative of our average total revenue here. So wherever we're at in that demand curve kind of represents the average total revenue from this number of wins. We can see the average total costs. The difference between the two is positive, right? That means revenue on average revenues are greater than cost across all units, which here are all expected wins. So you get positive profits. A natural monopoly is going to look something like, okay, another firm enters that city, right? They've now kind of encroached. So even if once that firm enters, we're both still able to act like somewhat monopolistic. So maybe this is, we can agree that we're both going to set prices and kind of try to act like a monopoly in this town. The only problem is we're now splitting demand. So even in the best case scenario, where each team kind of allows the other to, they agreed on prices and quantities to set across all these markets so that they're both still behaving like monopolists. There's just two of them now splitting demand. Well, the demand curve is now being split between both teams. You can kind of see here now the expected number of wins. If I go up to the new demand curve representing average total revenue, now the average total costs are going to be way higher. So as soon as another firm enters, we've now got this scenario where average total revenues are less than average total costs, profits are negative, right? And that's even under the best case scenario, right? Yeah.
So before you did the green,
yep,
that was an example of not monopoly, right?
We're just thinking about there was just one team, they had monopoly power, they were existing with positive profits.
Okay.
Another team comes in, they now have to split demand, even if they're still setting prices and behaving as though they're a monopolist, right? Like both of them are acting like that, but they're now splitting demand between two different teams, two different companies, firms now. So they're essentially, you can almost think about like they're splitting whatever profits would, or splitting the overall demand that would have existed before. However, the costs haven't changed at all, right? In terms of the huge fixed cost of owning and operating a team, right? So these huge fixed costs are really what's going to drive this idea of a natural monopoly. That as soon as I have to split demand, costs are just way too high. No one can make a profit at that point. You got it? Okay. Yeah. So this was the first team. It's just where their demand curve will be at after they're splitting demand. Yep. Probably in practice, it would probably look more like both of them act like it's more of a monopolistically competitive market. It's just that even on a monopolistically competitive market, because we're splitting overall demand within the city now, demand's too low, costs are too high, and no one can make a profit with two teams in that city. Questions here? So just to kind of, I guess, think about a little more like how did this go in practice? So it starts to get weird. I think I've got a slide, so I might be jumping the gun here a little bit, but it gets weird when we're thinking about monopoly power here. Because let's say we're thinking about like the Indianapolis Colts, right? If another team wants to enter the market, right, start another NFL team in Indianapolis, it's likely that, they're not going to take half of demand, but they are going to take a portion, right? There are going to be some people who just like NFL football. The ticket prices maybe at the Colts are higher because there's just, more legacy fans and things driving up the demand curve, driving up the price for tickets and apparel. And so maybe you start to see people, attending the other team. So you're going to at least get a portion of the existing demand if I put a new NFL team in. And maybe under that scenario, they would take enough demand where they would eat in, neither team could actually have positive profits. However, right, that proportion of fans they took, let's say instead of an NFL team entering Indianapolis, maybe an NHL team does. Well, I mean, the seasons are kind of played at different times. Yeah, there's some overlap. Maybe some people are just in general sports fans, right? I can't go to every single game. And so maybe I choose to go to a hockey game now instead of an NFL game over the year because I'm more of a hockey fan. And so maybe some of the demand, like kind of the demand for ticket revenue, the demand for apparel goes down a little bit for the Colts, but not near as much as when an NFL team enters. So it starts to get weird because like there's overall demand for the sport, then there's overall demand for sport, right? And then there's overall demand for different levels of sport, right? So any team entering the market, even if they're not in the same league, could still, take a little bit of the demand curve away from whatever team we're looking at. Now, it likely wouldn't be as large of a shift if an NHL team comes to Indy as opposed to another NFL team for the Colts, but they still could decrease that demand curve a little bit, eat into that monopoly power a little bit in terms of the monopoly power for just sport in general, right? Even the NHL team, they're not infringing on the monopoly power for professional football games with the Colts, but they are kind of infringing on that monopoly power when it comes to just overall demand for sport. Does that make sense what I'm saying there? So we could see like different kind of amounts of shifts there. So it gets really weird how we're defining monopoly power, right? Because, a lot of these teams don't have monopoly power for sport in their cities, but they do have monopoly power over their specific sport. All right. So that's exactly what I'm saying here. So I kind of already ruined this slide, this discussion. But the idea, if I'm thinking about, like, I used Indianapolis, so I'm thinking about Green Bay, the ticket market for sports, they don't have monopoly because, right, there's other types of sports being played, collegiate, even professional, basketball. But what about just for football games? We still are competing with the college team that's in the area. Okay, well, what about in-person football games? Well, people can drive. So even if you define this as like in-person NFL games, people could drive to Chicago. I mean, there's a lot of people in Wisconsin who are probably equidistant from both those cities. And so really what you would have to say is you only have monopoly for like attending your home football games, right? Or home NFL games, I should say. Okay. Questions for keep moving here on these general ideas. Yeah, time. Oh, okay, we're good. So, what we can think about what kind of helps create or continue this monopoly power. And we already talked a little bit about this, but like leagues try to protect this, like the leagues try to help out the teams as well. So, leagues force teams to pay in if they're going to enter into the market of where there's an existing team. I think I said the one I know was 75 miles for, I think, a couple of the leagues. I think it varies a little bit. But, these leagues, we see them behaving in a way where they're trying to keep monopoly power for their teams. One thing that we could potentially see, yeah.
Oh, where's the money go?
So I believe I think it's different in different situations. So like, I think the Clippers, when they moved to LA, that would specifically went to the Lakers. It gets weird when you had like the simultaneous move. I believe that money just went to the league. Because the league's like, yeah, if you're going to hurt, like we might be able to make a higher amount of profits, right, in LA if there's only one team versus two. So if you guys want to both go to LA, you're going to have to compensate us for those losses that we would have had from you having monopoly power in LA, paying in more additional money because they pay certain percents of revenue to the league. And so this money I know went to the league. And I believe it was like one of these things where it's redistributed evenly or used for kind of league expenses or things like that. But I'd have to look at, I don't know. I'm sure there's variation across the leagues as well. But yeah, the simultaneous move one was kind of weird where it didn't go to the team that was in the existing city because there wasn't. They both simultaneously moved there. So that money went to the league. But the other situations, like where you had the Clippers moving into LA when the Lakers were already there, that money went to the actual team that was already existing in that city. Kind of like compensating them for the losses that they're going to experience because of you entering in and no longer having monopoly power. Yep. The other thing that we have seen is that leagues will do is if they think that there is a big market and they have a competitor that's already in that city, they might so the NFL put teams in Dallas and Minnesota because the AFL had teams there. So they were like, look, we're big enough to withstand the losses for a short period of time. So let's put in some competing teams. We'll take away the AFL's monopoly power in Dallas and Minnesota and kind of, that's create a barrier to entry, make it harder for the AFL to kind of continue to compete with us, which eventually worked out for them, right? It drove them to extinction, I guess, although they kind of tried to come back. Another thing we might see, and this is just, this is not real technical, but, what's something, even if I'm not thinking about the same sport. So I talked about, maybe I want to ensure that I have a monopoly for just sport in general in my city, right? So what's a good example of a city that only like Portland, right? They only have one professional team I can think of. Is there a hockey team in Portland? No one knows. I don't think there is. So like that's a good example. Maybe like Portland Trailblazers, the only professional team in Portland. But maybe, what do we see a lot of NHL and NBA teams do? They share facilities because they really need a very similar shape sort of arena. They're both playing indoor games. And so it makes sense to split the costs, right? Especially if we have not a lot of overlap in our season, or at least we can kind of schedule correctly. So what you might see is that if I'm just worried about, if I'm the Portland Trailblazers, maybe I don't make any agreements with an NHL team because I want to keep monopoly power for just sport in general, right? So that's possible. I don't know if there's like strong evidence of this occurring. It's hard to kind of know how many conversations are had behind the scenes. You can imagine that's another barrier entry that could be made. TV deals, right? So once I sign a TV deal, you think about it as though no one else can like have games in those time slots, and so maybe I'm kind of creating some barriers to entry because there's so much money to be made in selling off these broadcast rights. When the AFL did theirs in the 60s, right? That's kind of the only thing that was keeping that league propped up. So maybe these huge TV deals being signed prevents other kind of competing leagues from kind of popping up, which is why I think, well, it's interesting. So anytime we've seen competing leagues more in recent history, the only ones that have been quote unquote successful are usually ones that are owned and operated by the professional league. Like, so it's almost like they're creating like a minor leagues, right? You kind of see this with the G League for the NBA. I know the NFL is trying to start, I don't even know what they're calling it, spring football or something like that. But basically it's kind of an arm of the existing NFL. And, that way they kind of, already have kind of the broadcast rights with NBC, CBS. And so it's easier for them to kind of sell to those companies because the secondary league, the quote unquote competitor, really isn't a competitor, right? They're owned by themselves or owned by the other professional leagues. And then, so, right, if you don't get those good deals or you do poorly on TV, we've seen that kind of tank leagues before. Yeah.
So the UFC, you consider
So this is one of those things where I would probably argue that they're a natural monopoly in the sense that there's definitely competing leagues, right? But when it comes to, well, I say natural monopoly, well, this is again where it gets challenging, right? So if I'm thinking about professional baseball and minor league baseball, those are two different products. There's only enough quality players to really have one league with as high of a quality as maybe the professional league does, right? And so I think what I would probably describe the UFC situation is the talent level, the quality of the product can only, like the product that the UFC is putting out, that level of quality, there aren't enough like fighters to really have a secondary competing league that has as high a quality of product. They probably don't have complete monopoly power over MMA, right? There's other leagues or organizations, but in terms of monopoly power over that higher level of a quality of product, I'd probably argue, they have a monopoly there. And that's another thing where it gets hard when you're looking at competing leagues, because almost every example we have, like the XFL didn't have the quality of product that the NFL does because they're never going to have as high quality player, or they at least at the time didn't have as high quality players. All right, we got 25 minutes. So I think I got enough time for this story. So, when we see monopoly power exist in general markets, I think I went through on Thursday on that Zoom class. We talked a little bit about surplus and kind of thinking about this monopoly power is causing this deadweight loss, but it's really also eating into what would have been consumer surplus and giving it to producers, right? So in general, we don't like this. We don't like monopoly behavior because it hurts consumers. So we try to get rid of it, right? So there's all these acts. The Sherman Act, is trying to target companies who have monopoly power, kind of break up monopolies, create more competition, eliminate barriers to entry. That way consumers can kind of get back some of their surplus. That's a general idea, right? Now there's exemptions made for like a natural monopoly because you can't have competition. As soon as there's a second firm, that was a situation, as soon as there's a second team, no one can make profits and you just go right back to one. So we're not going to punish a company, not going to punish a team if they've got natural monopoly power. So when we think about the definition of a monopoly, it really can be, even if it's not the only firm, if it's firms that are acting in a way where they're coordinating actions to act as though as a monopolist, right? Well, sports leagues are essentially that, right? They're coordinating the actions, the behaviors of all these teams so that the league can act as a monopoly, right, for that specific sport. So it also does things like establish rules, kind of prevents teams from like moving to certain areas, kind of creating barriers to entry there. There's some collusion potentially that's happening between these teams. Essentially, they're trying to organize or kind of coordinate their actions. Right? So why don't they kind of get hit, or why don't they fall victim to kind of being broken up by like the Sherman Act? Right? So we'll kind of go back and look at just what the Supreme Court has said on it. Right? So you have to go all the way back to 1901. The American League popped up and started competing with the existing National League. And I mentioned this a little bit already, where the National League only had like 8 teams. From not entering these new markets, the American League was able to pop up in some of these new large cities where population was growing, and really you had 2 competing leagues there. However, go forward 15 years and we have a 3rd league pop up as well. So kind of the same sort of scenario. And these teams were expanding into new markets, and maybe there was enough opportunity for a 3rd team to start, right? Well, by this time, the American League and National League had kind of already come together, right? So they were really 2 leagues acting as one, right? They're Major League Baseball. They're already come together, already merged. So when they see this 3rd league pop up and try to compete with them, they start to deny, right, the kind of competing federal league from having any like contract talks or kind of making any deals with their players. So even if the games were played at different times, maybe if a player wanted to play in both leagues, the Major League Baseball wasn't allowing for that to happen. So they were like preventing the federal league from kind of obtaining their labor, right? So the federal league brought this to court, said like they're preventing kind of free and mobile kind of labor here. Like this is illegal. Kennesaw Mountain Landis was just a coincidence that his name is close to mine. But at the time, he was kind of known as like this guy who was, using the Sherman Act to like break up all these monopolies, right? All this, try to prevent companies from owning even what word am I looking for? Like the entire kind of like all of the inputs, right? So they didn't have kind of control over the entire production process of whatever good they are. And so everyone thought, okay, he's gonna, put some type of pressure on Major League Baseball to not continue to act this way. Right? However, he's a big baseball fan. Actually ended up ruling against the federal league. He said that it was okay what the Major League Baseball was doing, that it had an exemption, and it wasn't subject to antitrust laws, right? Coincidentally, he became Major League Baseball's first ever commissioner. I'm not saying, who knows if there was some quid pro quo there, but it's a little bit coincidental, right? So going all the way back to this case up until today, this has really been the court's kind of response to whether or not sports are subject to these antitrust laws. They go all the way back to this precedent and say that from this case on, it has been that, the precedent is that Major League sports are exempt from kind of falling under the rules and regulations of these antitrust laws like the Sherman Act. And it's said that they can't use it as precedent, but it has been. I mean, it has been referenced as precedent. So even at the time, they said that this shouldn't like change future decisions, but it has, right? So we see that professional sports kind of basically has an exemption. They're able to operate with this monopoly power. So all these models we're looking at makes sense, right? They're able to actually have monopoly power without the fear of the government coming in and telling them you can't do things like prevent your players from, talking with other leagues and working for them. Okay. So with this exemption, right, they really started to kind of run wild. Okay. So if we think about now, not just the product market, we'll take a little bit of a look into the labor market for these sports, right? So it's, the labor market in sport is kind of weird in that if I want to be a professional football player, I have one league I can sign with, right? So when we think about the labor market, it kind of gets flipped, I think, and it's hard for us to think about because we think like we're consumers, right? Unfortunately, I mean, I don't know if it's fortunately or unfortunately, but like we are like consumer, country. Like we are kind of consumerism has taken over. And so I think a lot of us, our default is think about the consumers, the people purchasing, like that's how we see it, right? But in the labor market, the people purchasing the good, the people spending money on your labor are the companies. So the consumers would actually be the sports teams, right? Or the sport league, right? The league. The producers or the sellers of the good, well, these would be the players. They're providing their labor, right? So we kind of end up with this weird, kind of everything's kind of flipped, but we can think about what this is going to look like. So think about the quantity of labor here, and then the price for labor is going to be wages. Now, when it comes to these sporting examples, usually the terminology we use is like salaries, right? Because they're signing these huge contracts. So we're not thinking about necessarily hourly, but we're thinking about kind of this, maybe you could think about like an average wage if you took their salary and kind of priced it out. So we're going to have some demand curve for labor and then some supply curve for labor. Right? Now that demand curve for labor is coming from the teams or the league itself. Right? So if we think about it, obviously every player really has their own labor market because once again, we get into the fact that it's not the same product, right? Michael Jordan's labor supplied to a team is not the same as, I'll pick on Grayson Allen because he just injured a player on a team I like. So Grayson Allen, some no-name kind of backup, right? He's selling a different product. His quality of play isn't as high as maybe Michael Jordan's, right? And so, or choose your players of different quality levels, right? So we're really having to kind of assume away for a second, or what really is going on. We're thinking about players who can offer the same quality of labor, right? So if that helps kind of, we're not comparing the best high quality player in the league to the lowest quality. We're comparing players within like the same cohort of quality. So the only people that are consuming that labor or have demand for that labor are teams, but really when we're thinking about kind of who has demanded labor, there's only one league. So it's almost like there's only one consumer of this person's labor. If there can only be one consumer, we would call that having monopsony power. Not only can we think about this in terms of the league has some monopsony power, but if we go back, right, it used to be that once you signed with a team, they had full rights to either trade you or sign you, right? No one else could sign you unless that team traded your rights away, right? They could make new contracts with you, but no one else could unless they traded the rights, right? So it's called the reserve clause in baseball. So it gave not only the league monopsony power, it gave every team, every individual team monopsony power over their players, right? So the way that monopsony power works is kind of exactly the opposite of monopoly power. So let's first identify, before I get my monopsony power in here, if this was a perfectly competitive labor market, players were allowed to kind of switch teams once their contracts were up. They didn't have to, wait for the teams to trade away their rights. We can think about my equilibrium wage here. We'll call this perfectly competitive, and kind of the quantity of labor we could identify as well. Generally here we think more of wages, like the quantity of labor hours. It gets a little bit goofy because like here quantity, like I'm playing the same number of games, or maybe I could choose to play a little bit less minutes or something like that, depending on the game. So maybe a way to think about here is even if I'm giving up the same amount of time, I'm putting in the same hours of labor, players could provide different like levels of effort in those hours. So if it gets harder to measure this, we're thinking about how many hours the player devotes to the team. We can think about it as hours because they could practice a higher number of hours, right? They could play a few more minutes, but you also can think about the quantity of labor here being like the intensity level, right? If we were able to measure labor hours in terms of their quality, we had a nice continuum for that. That's really probably more so what this x-axis is going to represent to us. And that's just like the nature of sport in the sense that like the games all have the same amount of time. So you can't put more hours in terms of actually playing the game, but you can do things like practice more or put in more intense practices, like increase the quality of your labor hours. So once we have monopsony power, and I'll draw it in a different color just so we can identify it, instead of like facing a twice as steep marginal revenue, we can think about it as if there's one consumer, they're now purchasing the product. So they want to set the wage that minimizes their expenditures, right? So they're going to make decisions off of a twice as steep marginal expenditure curve. And now instead of being twice as steep as demand, like marginal revenue, my marginal expenditure, remember, my supply curve represents marginal cost. My marginal expenditure curve, if I'm setting one price for this weight, or this labor, one wage, it's now going to be a twice as steep marginal expenditure curve, twice as steep as my supply curve. Okay. Now from there, just like before, when monopoly power, we chose the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Here, I'm going to set my marginal expenditures where those are going to be equal to the marginal benefits here. Right? That's the quantity that the monopsonist would choose, right? They have monopoly power. They're the only consumer, just like a monopoly is the only producer of a good. Monopsony, they're the only consumer. But then for the firm, the team, right? They're the one that has this monopsony power, right? They're going to say, well, look, we know that this player would be willing to play for wherever they're at on their supply curve. So we can actually set the wage a little bit lower than it would be if it was a perfectly competitive market. So this reserve clause gave each team this power. So really what's going to end up happening as a result of that is players are going to get paid less. Okay. And maybe even if we think about this like across the league, if they have monopsony power, like they weren't allowing players to even go talk to the federal league, right? We would actually see fewer kind of players there than the perfectly competitive point. Because if it was truly perfectly competitive, these players could have went to this other league, right? We would have seen an increase in the labor market for Major League Baseball players, even though it was across two leagues, right? We're still thinking about the market for their labor. It doesn't matter which league it's in. It's just once they had that monopsony power, there was no ability to leave, and then we see players play for these lower wages or lower salaries at the time. Okay. Any questions over that? I think this is like the first time we've really kind of went specifically more into the labor market. So it's thinking about it a little bit differently than a general product market. And then monopsony power, right? Kind of having this twice as steep marginal expenditure curve. Any questions over that before we keep moving? All right. So they had this reserve clause, they had monopsony power, kind of leading to kind of lower overall wages. So we kind of already talked about this, right? We see a lower quantity of labor and a lower wage as a result of monopsony. You can kind of think about it. Another example of a monopsony market, I don't know as much about this, but I know that what I do know is that a lot of European soccer, so we see that national TV deals for these soccer games are made with the actual governments, right? And so you can think about it as, there's really only one person kind of selling these one consumer. If there's national television across these huge European markets, there's only one major broadcaster. There's like one consumer of the games, right? So there's one consumer of buying these broadcast rights if there's not competing corporations. And so under that scenario, even though it's not a labor market, we could still see monopsony power, right? And that would just give that one national broadcast company monopsony power over purchasing now not players, but purchasing the broadcast rights to these games. So they end up kind of being able to pay a lower price for these games if they're the only kind of national broadcast company where they don't have any competition, right? They're the only consumer of purchasing these soccer games. And that doesn't exist for every team, but I know there's a few where there's kind of national TV deals where there's a national broadcast company that has the rights to those games. And this was kind of, I think I left a blank slide for what I'd drawn earlier. So we kind of already looked at that. We'll dive a little bit more into this reserve clause. So we've got this reserve clause, which creates monopsony power. So even after a contract was over, a team had the rights to that player, and they were the only team that could negotiate with them, right? That player couldn't leave and sign a contract with another team. So this is a long time ago. So this is like, 50s, like or prior to the 50s. And so in 1950, there was a player who was sent to the minor leagues, right? Thought he was good enough to play on another Major League Baseball team, didn't want to be stuck in the minor leagues, but they weren't able to go sign a contract with someone else, right? So And actually, if I recall, I believe he was on the Yankees, right? And if you go back in this period of time, the Yankees had like a 10-year stretch, and we'll probably talk about on Thursday when we talk about competitive balance, where they were in like something like 8 of the 10 or 8 of 11 World Series games within that 10 to 11 year time block. They didn't win them all, but they were in the World Series that many times. And so this player on the Yankees, like they were, they had like the 9 best players, right? So he ends up getting demoted to the minor leagues. He probably could have played another team, but they had the right to, to that player. They don't want to see that player who's kind of good, not good enough to be on their team, but could definitely start on other teams. They're not going to make them better. So they just kind of keep him in the minor leagues, right? So he's upset about this, right? And tries to kind of take this to, to the courts. Once again, he doesn't, they kind of say that baseball is an exemption. They don't make a ruling on it. Then in 1970, finally, there was a player in Major League Baseball who was traded, right? So the players, like even under their contract, right, they could be traded away. He didn't, or they traded his rights away to Philly. Once he trades the rights away, the only team that he can now make a contract with is Philadelphia, right? So it's not like once they're traded, like I could, choose to make a, just wait it out and make a deal with another team. No, now this is the only team I can make a deal with. And at the time, Curt Flood was a black player. There was a lot of kind of racist, activities going on around Philadelphia that he didn't want to play in that city. He had racial discrimination concerns, took it to court and lost, right? He said, I should be able to, kind of make a deal with whoever I want. My contract is up. They just traded away my contract rights, right? Took it to court and lost, right? So after this, the players kind of realized like, this is not good. The courts are not going to be on our side. How can we get rid of this monopsony power, right? So the way in which they combated this monopsony power is they got together with, I forget all of the details of Marvin Miller, but essentially Marvin Miller helped a bunch of the players kind of organize and form a players union, right? So once he unionizes the players, how did that help combat that monopsony power? So I think, I should have left a blank slide here because I want to go over this, but since we already have the existing graph here, I'm going to just relabel a couple things so that we make sure. So this was monopsony power, right? The monopsony wage and monopsony quantity. So one way you can combat monopsony power is to gain monopoly power in the market. So what unionizing does is it now makes it so that there's only one supplier of labor. If you want to hire if you want someone to play for your Major League Baseball team, if we can get everyone in Major League Baseball to unionize, the only people you can hire are going to be in the union, right? So the union now is the only supplier of labor. So being the only supplier of something gives you monopoly power. So a union gives monopoly power in the labor market. So what would that look like? And I'll actually draw this where it was equal power here. So twice as steep marginal revenue curve. The union would then say, okay, our quantity that we would like, well, we want the same quantity of labor, but the union is like, well, look, we also know that this quantity, if we go up to the demand curve, this is how much teams or the consumers are willing to pay for that labor, right? So the monopoly says this is what we would like to set the wage at. Well, you now at least have monopoly and monopsony power. They both want wages to be in different places, and now it's left to the negotiating process, right? So now we have, this is where the lowest wage we will take. This is the highest wage that we're willing to pay. And maybe they don't have perfect information about each other's, what those wages would be. So then they come to the table, they bargain and come to some agreement in this range, right? Because any wage in this range, either one's okay with, right? If this was the wage, well, we know that the amount that teams would pay is way up here. The amount that players would accept is way down here. So both of them are going to be okay with that. So there it's just a matter of, then we kind of deal with some bargaining issues. Where exactly we're going to land up there, we don't know. But we at least know that it's going to be somewhere in that range, right? So before, players were getting paid this monopsony wage, at least now it's going to be something greater than that, right? Once we've unionized. I generally, like my 201 course in my personal life, I'll talk a lot of smack about unions, but this is actually one situation where you can see, like, if you've got monopsony power, the workers' only way to really fight that without, if the courts aren't going to step in, which they weren't in this case, is if you can unionize and get some monopoly power in that labor market. Any questions over? I know kind of put two things on the same graph, so yeah.
So supply labor, the players, correct?
Yep. So the players are supplying the labor. The teams in the labor market are demanding labor, right? They're consuming labor. Yeah, everything gets flipped on its head when we're looking at the labor market in terms of who's which curve, I guess, if you think about it that way. Other questions on that? And it doesn't have to be that they both want the same quantity. I just drew it that way, right? They could have like a little bit of a band where they would both choose like the optimal amount of labor to be as well. But it would be the same sort of idea as the wages. Even if there was a little discrepancy in the optimal quantities they both wanted, well, we know that they're ultimately going to arrive somewhere in that range once they come to the table and bargain. All right. So any more questions on that before we turn on? A little bit more I want to say, and then we'll probably close out for today. Okay. So, there's been kind of threats to monopoly power over time. None of them have really worked out. I kind of just have a list here. It's like every league has really at some point faced some competition. Usually when they do face competition, I didn't put Major League Baseball up here because really since the Federal League, there hasn't been like major competition. But even the original competition in Major League Baseball, American League was the competition to the National League. They've ended up merging, right? Because they both realize we're competing against each other. We could actually both earn higher profits if we just join together and act as a monopoly, right? And so even leagues that have been successful, so like the ABA and the NBA, eventually they merge, right? And if they, National Hockey League, they merge with I guess the World Hockey Association. I wasn't aware of this until I started looking into this. And then the NFL really has never had any major competitors where they've never merged with anyone. It's just been failed competition, or I guess they did merge with the AFL way back in the day, but in more recent years, right, they've had a lot of competing leagues that just haven't been successful. So it'll be really interesting. And I also don't have in here, I know that the XFL tried to start before the pandemic. I forget the exact details of it, but I think they tried to make a comeback. That didn't work either. So I should mention that as well. Yeah, I think that's more place. So NCAA cartel, we can pick up on that. So next class, we'll have a little more to say here in a second, but next class, we'll start looking at some game theory stuff. So we do a little bit of review and then kind of think about some situations in sport where game theory would apply. We'll then kind of start to dive into some kind of competitive balance stuff. So I think the paper I'm going to put up there will be one on competitive balance. And I might put two paper. Well, I'll put one up there so you can for sure see what the reading is, but I might bring a second paper to class as well that we'll look at. But there'll only be one up there that I expect you to kind of look through and probably have a question on that online quiz about. So one thing that's interesting to think about here is with all these competing leagues, it is interesting like that the NFL is starting a new league. So you can think about, they're really, they're not going to be playing in the same time slot, like in the same time of the year. And so even if I can't provide as high quality of a product in this other time period, right, in the spring, if I can generate any demand in the spring, so I've been thinking about where this fits in, and I'm not sure exactly, but we've talked about enough at this point. I think we can have a little discussion. Even if you look at that spring football league, and if you think about it, if it was acting as a competitor, so even though it's owned by the same people, if it is acting as a competitor with the NFL in any way, right? What's one reason why, even if they lose money in that spring league, why it might still be profitable for the NFL if they're the ones that own and operate? What are some maybe spillovers that could happen from that spring football league?
I mean, if they own it, they're like, they can really decide to do whatever they want. They can just constantly promote NFL and let you talk about their own brand.
Exactly, right? So I could use it as a marketing device to attract more consumers in the offseason, continue to keep football relevant throughout the entire year. And even though I'm taking a loss on that, it's just like a loss leader if we think of as a product. I might lose money on, milk, but I brought people into the store. I'm going to make money on every other thing they buy. So the idea here, but I might lose money on this spring football league, but I've just increased the demand for every other product I sell, apparel, the regular season NFL games. So it's kind of interesting to think about, when we see a lot of the newer successful, like I said, competing leagues recently, it's usually like minor leagues, and maybe those leagues aren't successful on their own, but they're driving demand up for the sport and kind of the professional kind of level up. All right, so those proposals are due by the end of the week. Homework due by the end of the day today. Kept you guys over a little bit. So I will see you on Thursday.